Vivienne Ashford froze in her own doorway. Her hand still gripped the cold brass handle when she heard it. Sharp, commanding, nothing like the quiet man she'd known for 6 months. "Shut up!" Preston's voice cut through the silence of her marble foyer, low and urgent. Her butler, her invisible, polite, never speak unless spoken to butler. The man who refilled her coffee without a sound now stood blocking the hallway, one arm raised behind him in a gesture she'd only seen in movies. Warning, protective, desperate. A thin line of blood traced down his knuckles. His eyes met hers for the first time in half a year, and what she saw there wasn't fear. It was training, control, the cold focus of someone who'd done this before. He mouthed 2 words. "Don't. Move." Somewhere upstairs, glass shattered. And Vivienne realized the most terrifying truth. The man she'd never truly seen had been the only one seeing everything. The mansion had always been too large for one person. Vivienne knew this the day she moved in, 6 months after the divorce papers were signed. 6 months after Bradford Whitmore walked out with half her assets and all of her trust. The 14,000 square foot estate in Greenwich had been her victory prize, her declaration of independence, her fortress of solitude. Each morning she woke in the master suite overlooking Long Island Sound, watched the sun rise over water she owned, but never touched, and reminded herself that emptiness was better than cruelty. The marble floors echoed her footsteps. The chef's kitchen remained spotless because she rarely ate at home. The library held books she'd meant to read. The pool reflected clouds she never watched, and somewhere in the staff quarters lived a man whose last name she'd forgotten. Preston Caldwell had appeared on a Tuesday in May, sent by the service she'd hired to manage her household. He was 42, wore shirts that had been ironed too many times, and moved through rooms like he was trying not to disturb the air itself. During the interview, he'd answered her questions with the minimum words necessary, maintained eye contact for exactly the appropriate amount of time, and never once asked about the small scar above her left eyebrow, the one Bradford had given her during an argument about her tone. Most applicants couldn't help themselves, their eyes drawn to imperfections, their curiosity barely masked. Preston had simply nodded when she explained his duties, accepted the offered salary without negotiation, and asked if he might use one of the basement rooms for his daughter during online school hours. The request had surprised her. Most live-in staff left their children elsewhere, but she'd agreed without discussion. The basement was unused anyway. 6 months passed in a rhythm Vivienne found almost peaceful. Preston arrived each morning at 6, prepared her coffee the way she liked it without ever being told, managed the housekeepers and groundskeepers with quiet efficiency, and disappeared into the basement each evening at 8. She rarely saw him. Occasionally, she'd hear the distant sound of a child's laughter from below, a reminder that life happened even in the corners of her fortress. But Preston kept his world separate from hers. He never lingered in doorways, never made small talk, never asked how her day had been or offered opinions on the news. He was the perfect employee, invisible, competent, forgettable. Vivienne appreciated the distance. After Bradford's suffocating control, after years of being watched and questioned and managed, Preston's indifference felt like respect. But there had been moments, small things she'd noticed without meaning to. The way Preston always checked the locks on the French doors before leaving each night, testing each handle twice as if the first time couldn't be trusted. The slight hesitation before he answered the doorbell, his hand reaching for something at his waist that wasn't there, a ghost habit from another life. Once, she'd come home early and found him teaching his daughter to pick a lock at the kitchen table. His voice patient as he explained tension and pressure and the particular click that meant success. He'd looked up, seen Vivienne watching, and simply gathered the tools without apology or explanation. The daughter, Hazel, she'd learned by accident, had waved cheerfully, completely unashamed. Vivienne had walked away, wondering what kind of father taught lockpicking as a life skill. She'd been at the office when the feeling started, a prickling awareness that had no rational basis, but refused to be ignored. The quarterly earnings call had gone well. Her team had landed the pharmaceutical contract they'd been chasing for months, and she should have stayed for the celebration drinks. Instead, she'd found herself making excuses, gathering her coat, driving home through evening traffic with her hands too tight on the wheel. The house came into view just after 7, earlier than she'd returned in weeks, and something about the familiar silhouette felt wrong. Not different. Nothing had changed, but wrong in the way a photograph looks wrong when you know the person in it is lying. She'd parked in the circular drive, walked to her own front door, and heard her butler's voice for only the second time in 6 months, saying words she never imagined he knew. Now, Preston stood 3 feet away, his body blocking the entrance to her own home, and Vivienne understood she'd been living with a stranger. The blood on his knuckles was fresh, bright red against his pale skin, and his shirt had torn at the shoulder seam. His breathing was controlled, measured, the kind of calm that came from training rather than temperament. Behind him, the grand staircase curved upward into shadow, and from somewhere in that darkness came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Preston's eyes never left hers. In the half-light of the foyer, she could see details she'd never noticed before. A small scar below his jawline, the kind that came from a blade rather than an accident. Calluses on his palms that didn't match a butler's work, and something in his posture that reminded her of security footage she'd seen of soldiers in doorways, human shields with nothing to lose. 2 men, Preston whispered, his voice barely reaching her across the space between them. Came through the second-floor balcony 20 minutes ago. I've contained them to the east wing, but they're armed. Each word was precise, economical, stripped of the deference he usually wrapped around his sentences. This wasn't a butler reporting a problem. This was someone giving a tactical briefing. Vivienne's mind struggled to catch up, bouncing between disbelief and a creeping certainty that she'd been living in a different story than she'd thought. Preston shifted slightly, his hand moving to the small of his back, and when it returned he was holding something small and black. A phone, she thought at first, but the shape was wrong, too compact, too purposeful. "Don't call the police," he said, reading her intention before she'd fully formed it. "Not yet. They mentioned Bradford's name, said they were here to deliver a message." The world tilted slightly, reformed around this new information. Bradford. Of course it was Bradford. Her ex-husband had made threats during the divorce, veiled suggestions about what might happen if she continued to pursue the full extent of his hidden assets. But her lawyers had assured her he was all posture, all performance. Men like Bradford Whitmore didn't actually get their hands dirty. They paid people, influenced people, but they didn't send armed men into homes. Except, apparently, they did.
I can't believe you brought me here for this.
Preston moved then, a small gesture with his free hand, beckoning her backward toward the door she'd just entered. His eyes flicked past her shoulder, checking the driveway, the angles of approach, reading the environment the way she read quarterly reports. "We need to get you out," he said, still in that whisper that somehow carried more authority than Bradford's loudest commands. "My car's in the back. I can get you to the police station somewhere public. Somewhere." A crash from upstairs cut him off, the sound of something large and expensive meeting marble floor. Preston's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from her, didn't let his attention splinter. "We're leaving. Now." But Vivienne didn't move, couldn't move, because she was suddenly, absolutely certain of something she couldn't explain. If she left now, if she ran from her own house, from these men Bradford had sent, she would never stop running. The divorce had been her first stand, her first refusal to be smaller than he needed her to be, and it had cost her 2 years of legal battles, millions in settlements, and every ounce of courage she'd ever accumulated. Running now would undo all of it. She would become again what Bradford had always wanted: manageable, afraid, controlled by the threat of violence she could never predict or prevent. No, she heard herself say, and the word surprised her with its steadiness. This is my house. Preston's expression shifted, something that might have been respect flickering across his face before discipline smoothed it away. Ms. Ashford, he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice carried a hint of emotion, something that sounded almost like admiration. These men are professionals. I can handle them, but not while protecting you. Please. The please did it, not because it was polite, but because it was desperate, human, stripped of all the careful distance he'd maintained for 6 months. This man, whoever he really was, actually cared whether she lived or died. The realization was oddly moving. She was about to answer when a voice called down from the 2nd floor, gravelly and amused. Lady of the house finally home? We were getting bored up here, waiting for you to finish work. The accent was local, the tone conversational, designed to sound casual in a way that made the threat more explicit. Preston's hand tightened around whatever he was holding, his body tensing in a way that reminded Vivienne of a drawn bowstring, all potential energy waiting for release. Stay behind me, he said, no longer whispering, no longer asking. Then he moved. What happened next took perhaps 15 seconds, but would replay in Vivienne's memory in slow motion for months afterward. Preston went up the stairs like water flowing upward, each step perfectly placed, his body low and balanced. At the landing, he pivoted left, and there was a sharp sound, not quite a crack, more like the sound of 2 hard things meeting at speed, followed by a man's startled grunt. Vivienne heard scuffling, the thud of bodies against walls, and then Preston appeared again, dragging a man by his collar, forcing him down the stairs with economical violence. The man was larger than Preston, broader, but he moved like his strings had been cut, stumbling and gasping. Preston deposited him at the bottom of the stairs, zip-tied his wrists behind him with movements that spoke of practice, and was already turning back upward before Vivienne could process what she'd witnessed. Second one's locked in the guest bathroom, Preston called down, his breathing barely elevated. Already secured. Called my people. They'll be here in 8 minutes to collect. His people, not the police. Not security she'd hired. His people. Preston descended the stairs again, stepping over the zip-tied man without looking at him, and finally met Vivienne's eyes properly. The professional mask had slipped, revealing something underneath that was tired, and real, and surprisingly gentle. I'm sorry, he said simply. I should have told you sooner. Should have warned you. The apology hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Vivienne couldn't begin to untangle. Told me what? She managed, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. That you're not actually a butler? That you've been, what? Guarding me? For 6 months? The questions came out sharper than she'd intended, anger rising now that the immediate danger had passed. Anger at being kept in the dark, at being protected without permission, at living in her own house with someone whose actual job description she couldn't even guess. Preston absorbed the tone without flinching, the way he absorbed everything, and nodded once. Yes, he said. All of that. The man on the floor groaned, trying to shift position, and Preston touched him once on the shoulder, a light pressure that somehow communicated absolute authority, and the man stilled. Vivienne looked at her butler, Hernan Butler, and saw him clearly for the first time. The careful posture wasn't deference, it was discipline. The quietness wasn't shyness, it was observation. The distance he'd maintained wasn't disinterest, it was professionalism of a kind she hadn't recognized, because it didn't match anything in her corporate experience. Who are you? She asked quietly. And Preston met the question with something that might have been relief. Someone who owed Bradford Whitmore's victim a debt, he said after a moment. Someone who knew what he was capable of long before you divorced him. The answer created more questions than it resolved, But before Vivienne could pursue them, headlights swept across the foyer windows, and Preston moved to the door with that same economical grace. Two men entered, dressed in dark clothing that suggested either security or something less official, and they collected the zip-tied intruder with brisk efficiency. Preston spoke to them in low tones, handed over the second man from upstairs, and accepted a folder one of them carried. The entire exchange took less than 3 minutes, and then the men were gone, taking Bradford's message deliverers with them, leaving nothing but disturbed air and the faint smell of adrenaline. Vivienne stood in her foyer in her 14,000-square-foot fortress and laughed. It started small, almost a cough, but built into something that bordered on hysteria, months of careful control fracturing under the absurdity of it all. She'd divorced Bradford to escape violence and control, had bought this house to prove she could stand alone, and all along, she'd been living with a bodyguard she hadn't hired, protected by someone whose motives she didn't understand. Safe only because a stranger had decided she was worth protecting. Preston waited until the laughter subsided, patient as always, and then offered quietly, "I'll pack my things. You'll want someone else, someone you actually chose." "I understand." "Don't," Vivienne said, the word coming out harder than she meant. "Don't you dare leave before I understand what the hell is happening." She walked past him into the living room, poured herself 3 fingers of scotch from the bar Bradford had chosen, and she'd kept out of spite, and sat in the leather chair that faced the windows. After a moment, Preston followed, standing in the doorway with that careful distance he'd perfected, and Vivienne gestured to the opposite chair. "Sit," she said, "and start talking. Who are you, really?" Preston Caldwell sat, and for the first time in 6 months, looked directly at her without the filter of his role between them. "I was DEA," he said simply. 15 years, specialized in financial crimes, organized trafficking networks, the kind of operations that look legitimate until you pull the right thread. Bradford Whitmore came across my desk 4 years ago. I couldn't touch him. He was too careful, too connected. But I knew what he was. Money laundering for pharmaceutical traffickers, using his venture capital firm as a front. When you filed for divorce, when you started threatening to expose his hidden assets, I knew he'd retaliate. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples Vivienne could feel spreading outward into everything she thought she knew. Bradford hadn't just been a controlling husband. He'd been criminal, and she'd lived with him for 8 years without seeing it. "Why didn't you arrest him?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Preston's expression flickered with something that might have been regret. "We tried. Got shut down from above. Too many people protecting him. Too much political capital at stake. I pushed too hard, asked too many questions, and got offered early retirement." The bitter edge in his voice suggested retirement hadn't been optional. "Lost my badge, lost my marriage, almost lost my daughter." Vivienne absorbed this, fitting pieces together. "So you became a butler." The statement was almost a question. Preston nodded. "Your divorce lawyer, Rebecca Chen. She's an old friend. Called me when Bradford started making threats, asked if I'd be willing to keep an eye on you. I needed work that let me stay with Hazel, and you needed protection you didn't know you needed. It worked." He said it like it was simple, like upending his entire life to protect a stranger was a reasonable career move. "For 6 months, I've been watching, checking backgrounds on everyone who enters this property, monitoring Bradford's associates, making sure his threats stayed theoretical. Tonight was the first time he escalated to action." "Why?" Vivienne asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "What changed?" Preston pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward her. On it was a news article dated that morning. Ashford Industries completes acquisition of Westfield Pharmaceutical. Her acquisition. The deal she'd been negotiating for months, the one that would make her company one of the largest pharmaceutical distributors on the East Coast. The deal that would give her access to supply chains Bradford had spent years infiltrating. "You just became a threat," Preston said quietly. "Not just an ex-wife with grievances, but someone with the power to actually expose what he's built." He couldn't let that stand. The scotch burned on the way down, grounding her in physical sensation, while her mind raced through implications. Bradford had sent men to her house, armed men, and they'd found Preston instead. Preston, who'd spent 6 months invisible and ignored, who'd lived in her basement with his daughter and asked for nothing, who'd put himself between her and violence without hesitation. "You could have been killed," she said, and Preston shrugged one shoulder, a gesture so casual it made her anger spike again. "It's the job," he said simply. "The one I chose." "I didn't hire you for this job," Vivienne shot back. "I hired you to manage my household, not to—" She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Die for her? Fight her battles? Play hero in a situation she hadn't known existed? Preston leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and for the first time she saw how tired he looked, the weight he'd been carrying visible now that he'd stopped hiding it. "You hired me to keep your home running smoothly," he corrected gently. "Part of that was keeping you safe. I don't apologize for doing what was necessary." They sat in silence, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking toward 9, and Vivienne thought about the invisible architecture of her life, the things that had protected her without her knowledge, the debts she owed to people whose names she'd never asked. "Hazel," she said suddenly, "your daughter. Where is she?" Preston's expression softened immediately, the first real emotion she'd seen from him all night. "With her grandmother. Safe. I don't bring her here on days when Bradford's people are active in the area." So he'd known. He'd known today might be dangerous, and he'd sent his child away and stayed anyway. "I want to meet her," Vivienne heard herself say. "Properly, I mean, not just passing in the hallway." Preston looked surprised, then cautious. "Ms. Ashford, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "You've been living in my house for 6 months, protecting my life, and I don't even know your daughter's favorite color. That's unacceptable." She stood, paced to the window, looked out at the dark water of Long Island Sound. "Everything changes now. You know that, right? I can't pretend you're just the help. Can't ignore what you did tonight. Can't go back to the way things were." Preston stood as well, maintaining that careful distance, and nodded. "I know. I can recommend another service, someone qualified to—" "Stop," Vivienne said, turning to face him. "I'm not firing you. I'm promoting you. Head of security, if that's what you want to call it, or personal protection, or whatever title makes sense for someone who fights intruders in my foyer. But you're not leaving." The words surprised her even as she said them, but they felt right. For 6 months, Preston had been the only person in her life who asked nothing from her, who protected without controlling, who maintained distance because she needed distance. The idea of replacing him with a stranger felt like erasure, like pretending tonight hadn't revealed something essential. Preston studied her for a long moment, and Vivienne watched him process the offer, weigh it against whatever private calculations he kept. "I'm not good at taking orders," he said finally, "especially when they're stupid. If you keep me on, I'll argue with you about security protocols, about risk assessment, about who you let into this house. It won't be comfortable." Vivienne felt something like a smile trying to form. "I'm not good at being told what to do," she countered, "especially by men who think they know better. If you stay, I'll ignore your recommendations when they're excessive, override your protocols when they're inconvenient, and generally make your job harder. It won't be comfortable." "Then we understand each other," Preston said, and extended his hand. Vivienne shook it, feeling the calluses she'd noticed earlier, the strength carefully controlled, and wondered what other truths had been hiding in plain sight. "I'll need to know everything," she said. Still holding his hand, about Bradford, about what he's involved in, about the people who might come next. No more protection by ignorance. Preston nodded slowly. It's not pretty. What he's built, what he's done. You might wish you'd stayed in the dark. Vivienne thought about Bradford's face the day she'd asked for divorce, the way his mask had slipped to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. She'd seen that darkness already. Knowing its full extent couldn't be worse than imagining it. I've spent too much of my life in the dark, she said, letting other people manage what I was allowed to know. I'm done with that. She released his hand, stepped back, felt the exhaustion of the evening settling into her bones. Tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow. Go through everything. Tonight? I just need. She gestured vaguely at the house around them, unsure how to articulate the need for normalcy, for space to process. Preston understood anyway, the way he seemed to understand everything. I'll do a perimeter check, make sure they didn't leave any surprises. Then I'll be in the basement if you need anything. He moved toward the door, and Vivienne called after him. Preston? He turned, waiting. Thank you, she said simply. For tonight. For 6 months of nights I didn't know needed protecting. Something in his expression eased, the professional armor thinning enough to show the human underneath. You're welcome, Ms. Ashford. He paused at the threshold, considering. Vivienne, he added, testing the sound of it. If we're changing the terms, we might as well get the names right. It was a small thing, a trivial shift, but it felt significant in the silence of her too large house. Vivienne, she agreed, and please stop calling your room the basement. It's the staff suite, or your apartment, or just home, something with dignity. Preston's smile was small but genuine, transforming his serious face into something younger, less burdened. Home works, he said. Then he was gone, moving through her house with the same quiet grace, checking doors and windows with practiced hands, while Vivienne stood in her living room and tried to understand how the architecture of her life had shifted in a single evening. She'd come home early on impulse, heard 2 words from a stranger's mouth, and discovered that safety she'd thought she'd built herself had actually been constructed by someone else's hands, someone else's vigilance, someone else's choice to stand between her and the consequences of marrying wrong. The scotch was gone. She poured another, carried it upstairs to her bedroom, and locked the door behind her, then unlocked it again, realizing the gesture was purely symbolic now. If Preston wanted to enter, a lock wouldn't stop him, but he wouldn't want to. That was the difference, she realized, between him and Bradford. Bradford had controlled by removing choices, by making himself essential, by ensuring she needed him. Preston controlled by creating space, by protecting her ability to choose, by making himself invisible until invisibility became impossible. One was possession, the other was service. She'd been too scarred to see the distinction until tonight. Sleep wouldn't come. So Vivienne stood at her bedroom window and watched the property lights Preston had turned on, tracking his movements through the grounds by the way illumination shifted and changed. Somewhere in the house below, possibly in the kitchen she rarely used, a 7-year-old girl would return tomorrow, and Vivienne would have to figure out how to talk to a child, how to be something other than the distant employer who signed paychecks and ignored humanity. The prospect was terrifying in ways armed intruders weren't, but she'd made the offer and meant it. Hazel was part of Preston's life, and Preston was no longer someone she could ignore. The night moved slowly. At some point, Preston returned inside, the lights shifting to their normal evening pattern, and Vivienne imagined him in the basement, the staff suite, checking on his daughter, debriefing with whoever his people were, filing reports or making calls, or doing whatever ex-DEA agents did after neutralizing home invasions. Did he think about her up here? Did he worry about her emotional state, her ability to process, her safety in ways that went beyond physical threat? The questions felt intrusive, too personal for an employer to ask about an employee. But the old categories didn't fit anymore. Preston wasn't an employee. He wasn't a bodyguard exactly. He was something she didn't have language for yet. Morning came eventually, pale light spreading across the sound, and Vivienne stood under the shower for 30 minutes, letting hot water wash away the residue of fear and adrenaline and revelation. When she emerged, wrapped in the robe Bradford had hated because it was shapeless, she found a note slipped under her bedroom door. Preston's handwriting, precise and economical. Hazel arrives at 10. Breakfast ready when you are. We'll talk after. No signature, no pleasantries, just information delivered efficiently. Vivienne smiled despite herself. Some things hadn't changed. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like armor. Tailored pants, silk blouse, heels that added 3 inches and made her feel less vulnerable. Then she descended to the kitchen and stopped in the doorway, surprised by the scene she'd interrupted. Preston stood at the stove, scrambling eggs with one hand while reading something on his phone held in the other, moving between tasks with the same economy he brought to everything. At the counter sat a girl with dark curls pulled into a messy ponytail, swinging her legs and explaining something about dinosaurs with the kind of passionate detail only 7-year-olds could muster. She broke off when she saw Vivienne, and her face lit up with uncomplicated delight. "You're Vivienne," Hazel announced, as if this was a wonderful discovery rather than stating the obvious. "Daddy said you wanted to meet me properly. I'm Hazel Elizabeth Caldwell, and I'm 7.5, and I know how to pick locks and identify poisonous plants, and I'm learning Mandarin Chinese because Daddy says knowing languages is a superpower." She delivered this biography in a single breath, grinning broadly, and Vivienne found herself grinning back without meaning to. This child was extraordinary, bright and fearless, and completely herself, in a way Vivienne dimly remembered being before the world taught her to be smaller. "I'm Vivienne Ashford," she replied, matching Hazel's formal introduction. "I'm 43 and I run a pharmaceutical company, and I know how to read financial statements and negotiate contracts. But I don't know anything about poisonous plants or lock-picking, so you'll have to teach me." Hazel's eyes widened with something like wonder, as if the idea that an adult might want to learn from her was revolutionary. "Really?" she asked, looking to Preston for confirmation. Preston, still focused on the eggs, nodded once. "Really," he confirmed. Vivienne's interested in expanding her skill set. Breakfast was strange and perfect. They sat at the kitchen island. Vivienne had a formal dining room, but it felt ridiculous for 3 people, and Hazel talked about her online classes, her favorite books, the hermit crab she was campaigning to adopt, despite her father's reservations about pets. Preston contributed occasional observations, mostly about why hermit crabs were impractical in their current living situation, and Vivienne found herself laughing, actual, genuine laughter, for the first time in months. This child, this small human who'd been living in her basement for half a year, was funny and smart and utterly without guile. Being around her felt like breathing clean air after months in a sealed room. After breakfast, Hazel disappeared to do schoolwork, and Preston led Vivienne to his suite, calling it that felt less awkward than basement, to show her what 6 months of intelligence gathering looked like. The space was smaller than she'd expected, but meticulously organized, one wall covered with maps and photographs and printouts, connected by red string in a pattern that would have looked paranoid if Vivienne didn't know it represented actual threats. Preston walked her through Bradford's network, the shell companies, and offshore accounts, the pharmaceutical distributors he'd compromised, the people he'd paid to look the other way. It was thorough, detailed, and utterly damning. "Why haven't you taken this to the FBI?" Vivienne asked, studying a photograph of Bradford shaking hands with a man Preston identified as a cartel liaison. "You have enough here to put him away for decades. Preston's expression went carefully neutral, and Vivienne recognized the look now. He was deciding how much truth she could handle. "I tried," he said finally. "Took everything to my old supervisor, built the case, got it ready for prosecution. Got shut down 48 hours later. Bradford has friends in very high places, people who benefit from his operation staying functional. The official reason was insufficient evidence. The real reason was politics." Vivienne felt cold certainty settling in her stomach. "They'll shut you down again. If you try now, with all this, they'll protect him again." Preston nodded slowly. "Unless the evidence comes from someone they can't ignore. Someone with credibility, resources, and a legitimate reason to have access to his financial records." He let the implication hang in the air, and Vivienne understood what he was suggesting. She could do what he couldn't, expose Bradford using the discovery process from their divorce, her position as a major pharmaceutical distributor, her reputation as a legitimate businesswoman. The establishment couldn't dismiss her the way they'd dismissed an early retired DEA agent with a grudge. "He'll retaliate," she said quietly. "Harder than last night. If I come after him with this kind of ammunition, he won't send thugs to deliver messages. He'll try to destroy me completely." Preston met her eyes, and she saw acknowledgement there, respect, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Yes," he agreed. "He will. And I can't promise I'll be able to stop everything he throws at you. I'm good, but I'm one person, and Bradford has resources I can't match." He paused, considering his words. "If you choose this path, your life becomes exponentially more dangerous. I need you to understand that before you decide." Vivienne looked at the wall of evidence, years of careful documentation, proof of crimes that had funded her marriage, her lifestyle, her willful ignorance. She thought about the women Bradford must have hurt beyond her, the communities destroyed by the drugs his network moved, the systems corrupted by money she'd spent without asking where it came from. She thought about Hazel upstairs, learning Mandarin and lock-picking from a father who'd sacrificed his career to do the right thing and been punished for it. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be on the other side of this choice. "I'm doing it," she said. "Not just for me. For everyone he's hurt. Everyone he'll hurt if someone doesn't stop him." Preston nodded, unsurprised, and pulled out a fresh folder. "Then we need to talk strategy. Bradford will know something's wrong the moment you start filing motions to reopen discovery. He'll come at you fast, try to discredit you before your evidence gets traction. We need to be ready for legal attacks, media campaigns, possibly more physical threats. Are you prepared for that?" Vivienne thought about the last 2 years, the divorce proceedings where Bradford had tried to paint her as unstable, vindictive, mentally unwell. She'd survived that. She could survive worse. "What do you need from me?" she asked, and Preston's smile was sharp, tactical. "Access to your legal team, your accountants, anyone who touched your divorce settlement. I need to know every piece of information they have, every document they pulled, every angle they considered. Then we build the case properly, airtight, using only evidence you had legitimate access to. Bradford can't claim entrapment or illegal investigation if everything comes from your own records." He was already moving, pulling files from a locked cabinet, spreading documents across the desk. "It'll take weeks to organize, months to prosecute. You'll need protection every day, surveillance on your office, background checks on anyone new who enters your life. Your privacy basically ends." "My privacy ended when I married Bradford," Vivienne countered. "At least this time I'm choosing the invasion." They worked through the morning, Preston explaining investigative techniques and legal strategies, while Vivienne absorbed information with the same focus she brought to board meetings. Somewhere around noon, Hazel appeared with sandwiches she'd made herself, proud of her competence, and they took a break to eat and listened to her explain the difference between igneous and sedimentary rocks. The juxtaposition was surreal. Plotting to bring down a criminal network while a 7-year-old lectured about geology. But somehow it felt right, like this was what normal should have been all along. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Vivienne's lawyers received carefully curated information, began filing motions, asking questions designed to corner Bradford into producing records he'd rather keep buried. Preston became a constant presence. No longer invisible, but deliberately visible, a reminder to anyone watching that Vivienne Ashford was protected. Hazel integrated into the household like she'd always belonged there, doing homework at the kitchen counter, teaching Vivienne to identify edible plants in the garden, asking questions about business, with the kind of curiosity that made Vivienne see her own company through fresh eyes. The house stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like something dangerously close to a home. Bradford's response was predictable and vicious. Articles appeared questioning Vivienne's mental stability, her business acumen, her motives for harassing her ex-husband with baseless accusations. Former employees came forward with stories about her erratic behavior, her impossible demands, her concerning relationship with household staff. The attacks were coordinated, professional, and largely ineffective because Preston had anticipated them all, prepared responses, documented the pattern of harassment. What Bradford didn't know was that every attack, every attempt to discredit her, created more evidence of consciousness of guilt, more proof that he had something worth hiding. 3 months into the campaign, Bradford made his mistake. He sent his lawyer to Vivienne's office with an offer: drop the investigation, sign an NDA, accept a generous settlement, and he'd leave her alone forever. The offer itself was standard intimidation, but the lawyer made the mistake of adding a threat. Mr. Whitmore would hate to see anything happen to your staff. That butler of yours, the one with the daughter? Accidents happen, especially to people who involve themselves in situations they don't understand. Preston had been listening from the next room, recording every word, and when the lawyer left, they had him on tape threatening a child. That threat changed everything. Preston contacted his old supervisor, the one who'd shut down his investigation years ago, and presented the recording along with evidence of Bradford's network and the attempted bribery. This time, with a threat against a child on tape, with Vivienne's credibility lending weight to the accusations, with media attention making the case impossible to bury quietly, the FBI couldn't ignore it. Within a week, Bradford was indicted on 7 counts of money laundering, conspiracy to traffic controlled substances, and witness intimidation. His arrest made national news, his carefully constructed reputation crumbling under the weight of evidence that had been waiting years for someone brave enough to expose it. Vivienne watched the news coverage from her living room, Preston beside her on the couch that had always been too large for one person, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but relief. The man who'd controlled her life for 8 years, who'd made her doubt herself and her worth, who'd turned her into something small and afraid, was finally being held accountable. Not because she'd been strong enough alone, but because she'd accepted help, trusted someone who'd proven trustworthy, allowed herself to be protected while learning to protect others. The victory was shared, collaborative, nothing like the solitary achievement she'd always thought strength required. Hazel wants to know if we can get that hermit crab now, Preston said during a commercial break, his tone deliberately casual. Says if we defeated the bad guy, we've earned a pet. Vivienne laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. Tell her we'll think about it, but she has to prove she can handle the responsibility. She paused, considering. And she has to teach me about hermit crab care first. I won't have animals in this house I don't understand. Preston's smile was warm, genuine, the expression of someone who'd spent 6 months invisible and was slowly remembering how to be seen. Deal, he said. Then, more seriously. What happens now? After the trial, after Bradford's sentenced. Do you want me to stay? The question hung between them, weighted with implications they'd both been avoiding. Vivienne thought about the house, imagined it without Hazel's laughter in the kitchen, without Preston's quiet presence making sure the doors were locked. Thought about going back to empty rooms and solitary dinners, and the kind of safety that came from being alone. "I want you to stay," she said carefully. "Not as an employee, not exactly. As," she struggled for the right word, the right category. "As family. The chosen kind. The kind that decides to keep showing up." Preston absorbed this, his expression unreadable, and Vivienne rushed to fill the silence. "I know that's complicated. I know I'm your boss, technically. And there are power dynamics, and probably HR implications if this were a normal company. But nothing about this situation is normal, and I don't want to pretend it is." "I don't want normal," Preston said quietly. "Normal means invisible, means keeping Hazel hidden away because she's inconvenient, means protecting you from a distance and never actually connecting." He shifted to face her properly, and Vivienne saw vulnerability in his expression, the same careful hoping she felt. "I want this. What we've built, the three of us figuring things out together. But I need to know you want it too, not because I saved you, or because you feel grateful, but because you actually want us here." Vivienne reached out, took his hand the way she had the night everything changed, and held on. "I want you here," she said firmly. "Both of you. Not because of gratitude, though I am grateful. Not because of protection, though I appreciate being safe. But because when I think about my life going forward, about what I want it to look like, it has Hazel teaching me about poisonous plants, and you arguing with me about security protocols, and all of us being weird and complicated together." She squeezed his hand. "I spent 8 years with someone who made me smaller. I want to spend whatever comes next with people who help me be bigger." Preston kissed her then, soft and careful, asking a question with the gesture, and Vivienne answered by pulling him closer, deepening the kiss, claiming this moment of connection after months of careful distance. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, she could hear Hazel upstairs, singing something off-key and enthusiastic, and the sound made her smile against Preston's shoulder. This was what home felt like. Not perfection, not safety, but chosen family and complicated joy and the knowledge that someone would stand between you and danger without being asked. The trial took 6 months, dominated headlines, ended with Bradford receiving a 20-year sentence in a federal facility. Vivienne testified, calm and precise, presenting evidence of financial crimes with the same competence she brought to quarterly earnings calls. Preston sat in the gallery every day, Hazel beside him when school allowed, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. When the verdict came down, Vivienne felt closure, real and final, the last thread of Bradford's control severing cleanly. She walked out of the courthouse, took Preston's hand, and let Hazel grab her other hand, and together they navigated the media circus, a family in all the ways that mattered. Months later, on a Saturday morning in early fall, Vivienne found herself in the garden with Hazel, learning to identify edible mushrooms while Preston supervised from the patio, reading case files for his new position as consultant to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The hermit crab, named Justice because Hazel had a sense of drama, resided in a carefully maintained tank in what was no longer called the basement, but had become Preston and Hazel's wing of the house. Vivienne's company had weathered the scandal, emerged stronger, and she'd used her new platform to advocate for stronger pharmaceutical regulations, making amends in her own way for years of willful ignorance. "This one's poisonous," Hazel announced, pointing to a mushroom with confidence. "See the white gills? That's the tell. You eat that, you die horribly." She said it cheerfully, unbothered by mortality, and Vivienne made careful notes in the field guide Preston had given her. "Good to know," she said seriously. "I'll avoid the white gills." They worked in companionable silence, Hazel occasionally breaking into explanations about spore patterns or biological kingdoms, and Vivienne found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here, from trapped and afraid to kneeling in dirt with a 7-year-old teacher, learning survival skills she'd never imagined needing.
Brought me here for this.
Preston called them in for lunch eventually, and they gathered around the kitchen island that had become their unofficial headquarters. Hazel reported on the mushroom expedition with scientific precision, while Preston plated sandwiches and Vivienne poured lemonade. And somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of it all, she realized this was everything she'd been looking for when she'd bought the too large house. Not independence exactly, and certainly not isolation, but chosen interdependence, the kind of family that formed by decision rather than obligation, by showing up and staying and trusting that other people would show up and stay too. "I'm thinking about adopting," Vivienne said suddenly, the words surprising her, but feeling right once voiced. Both Preston and Hazel looked up, matching expressions of curiosity. "Not right now," she clarified quickly, "but eventually. There are kids who need families, and we have space. And I keep thinking about how much Hazel's taught me about, well, everything. It seems selfish to keep that to ourselves." She looked at Preston, trying to read his reaction. "I know that's a big decision. But I'm not suggesting we rush into anything. But I wanted to say it out loud, see how it felt." Hazel's squeal of delight was answer enough. "Can we adopt a sister? I've always wanted a sister. Someone to teach about plants and locks, and maybe she could like different things than me, so we could learn from each other." She was already planning, already imagining, and Vivienne felt her heart expanding to accommodate this child's boundless optimism. Preston was quieter, but when he met Vivienne's eyes, she saw agreement there, and something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition that she was choosing them over and over in increasingly permanent ways. "We'll look into it," Preston said carefully. "Do the research, understand the process, make sure we're ready." He reached across the counter, took Vivienne's hand briefly. "But yes, I think we should." The simple affirmation felt monumental, a promise that their accidental family could become intentional, could grow and change and face whatever came next together. Vivienne squeezed his hand, released it, and turned back to Hazel, who was already listing names for hypothetical siblings, with the kind of enthusiasm that made everything seem possible. That evening, after Hazel had gone to bed, Vivienne and Preston sat on the patio overlooking the Sound, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The house behind them was lit warmly, lived in and loved. No longer a fortress, but a home. "You know Bradford gets out in 20 years, Preston said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Might be less with good behavior. He'll still be dangerous." Vivienne considered this, the shadow of future threat, and found she wasn't afraid. 20 years is a long time," she replied. "We'll be different people, stronger, more prepared." She leaned against his shoulder. "And he'll come out to find we built something he can't touch." Preston wrapped his arm around her, solid and warm, and Vivienne felt safe in a way that had nothing to do with physical protection. This was the safety of being fully known, fully seen, and chosen anyway. "I love you," she said, testing the words, finding them true. "I don't know when it happened exactly, somewhere between shut up and mushroom identification, but it happened, and I needed you to know." Preston kissed the top of her head, gentle and sure. "I love you too," he said simply. "Have for months, probably since you demanded to meet Hazel properly. Insisted on seeing us as human instead of just help." They sat in the growing dark, two people who'd found each other through violence and circumstance, who'd chosen to stay through everything that came after. Somewhere inside, Hazel slept peacefully, safe in a home that held her without hiding her. Tomorrow they'd start researching adoption processes, figuring out how to expand their family. Next week, Vivienne had meetings about pharmaceutical regulations, and Preston had consultations about ongoing investigations. The world continued, complicated and dangerous, and full of Bradford Whitmores who thought power meant control. But here, in this moment, on this patio, Vivienne Ashford was exactly where she needed to be, with people who loved her, in a home she'd chosen, building a future she could finally imagine. The stars multiplied overhead, infinite and indifferent, and Vivienne thought about the woman who'd walked through her door 6 months ago, heard "shut up" from a stranger, and discovered that being saved wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Everything that came after, the trust, the family, the love, that was the real victory, the real reclamation of a life Bradford had tried to steal. She'd needed someone to stand between her and danger long enough for her to learn to stand on her own. Preston had done that. Now they stood together, equal partners facing whatever came next, and Vivienne had never felt more powerful. "Hermit crabs can live 30 years in captivity," Preston said randomly, and Vivienne laughed into the darkness. "Are you telling me we're stuck with justice for 3 decades? She could hear the smile in his voice when he answered. "Just warning you, this family you're building has long-term implications." Vivienne tightened her arm around his waist, anchor and promise. "Good," she said. "I'm done with short-term anything. I want the full 30 years, complications and all." And in the house behind them, warm with light and possibility, a family slept and dreamed and grew roots deep enough to weather any storm. Not perfect, not simple, but absolutely